Tell you all about it.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Ukraine, Albania, Andorra, Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Chile, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Liberia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Marshall Islands, Monaco, Montenegro, the Netherlands, New Zealand, North Macedonia, Norway, Palau, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Korea, Republic of Moldova, Romania, San Marino, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Uruguay, and the European Union. We condemn in the strongest terms the Russian Federation's illegitimate attempts to organize Russian presidential elections in temporarily occupied areas within the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Holding elections in another UN member state's territory without its consent is in manifest disregard for the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Such elections have no validity under international law. We recall the United Nations General Assembly's resolution ESS 11/4, adopted at its emergency special session on October 12, 2022, that declared the Russian Federation's attempts to hold illegal so-called referendums in September 2022 in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine had no validity under international law and do not form the basis for any alteration of the status of those regions of Ukraine. An overwhelming 143 countries voted in support of the resolution and affirmed core principles under international law by condemning these so-called referendums. We also recall General Assembly Resolution 68/262 of March 27, 2014, which similarly underscored that Russia's referendums held on March 16, 2014 in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol had no validity and cannot form the basis for any alteration of the status of these regions. We reiterate the UN General Assembly's call to all states, international organizations, and the United Nations specialized agencies not to recognize any alteration by the Russian Federation of the status of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, as well as of any or all of the Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, or Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine, and to refrain from any action or dealing that might be interpreted as recognizing any such altered status. We demand the Russian Federation refrain from holding illegitimate elections in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. We reiterate the General Assembly's call for the Russian Federation to stop its war of aggression against Ukraine and to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, extending to its territorial waters. I thank you. I would like to thank all my colleagues who came to join me at delivering this statement, and I think they may leave because I would like then to make a statement of my own in my national capacity. Thank you very much. Sarah, nice to see you. So I also would like to draw your attention to today's press briefing in Geneva of the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine in the context of the armed aggression of the Russian Federation. The Commission is carrying out important work in accordance with its mandate. The advanced, unedited version of the report is available on the website of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The findings of the Commission are truly horrifying. Let me quote the Commission's conclusions. The evidence gathered has reinforced the Commission's previous findings that Russian authorities use torture in a widespread and systematic way. These issues directly relate to the Security Council meeting, which will begin in a few minutes, as it concerns egregious war crimes occurring daily against Ukrainians in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And let me quote the latest report. Recently analyzed information is suggestive of the hierarchical nature of the services involved in the commission of torture, the knowledge of superiors and prevailing sentiment of impunity. Let me give you another quote. Victims' accounts disclose relentless, brutal treatment, inflicting severe pain and suffering for almost the entire duration of their detention, with blatant disregard for human dignity, leading to long-lasting physical, mental trauma. The Russian side continues to bury its head in the sand. As noted in the Commission's report, and I quote, it regrets that its efforts to engage with the Russian Federation remain unsuccessful. The Commission has addressed 23 written requests for meetings, access, and information without receiving any answer from the Russian side. Therefore, we are not going to take lectures from Russian Federation, who have had ample opportunities to provide the Commission with access and information. And we call on Russia to start implementing the decisions of the UN main bodies, including the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council and the ICJ, to comply with international humanitarian law, which includes immediately cease this aggression and all acts of violence committed against civilians and prisoners of war in violation of applicable international human rights and international humanitarian law, and the use of torture and other forms of ill treatment against both civilians and prisoners of war. I thank you.
Ambassador Nadia Sitima from Al Jazeera English. What is your message to civilians who participate in elections in occupied Ukrainian territories, particularly those who feel pressured to participate?
The participation in the illegal attempts to organize so-called presidential elections of a foreign country in the territory of Ukraine is illegal, and whoever facilitates this organization of the elections is liable under Ukrainian criminal law. All right? Thank you very much.
The 9,577th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Situation in Afghanistan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Afghanistan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/234, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Japan. I wish to also draw the attention of the Council members to document S/2024/196, the report of the Secretary General on the situation in Afghanistan and its implications for international peace and security. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/234 please raise their hand? The result of the voting is as follows. The draft resolution received 15 votes in favor. The draft resolution has been adopted unanimously as Resolution 2727/2024. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Japan. I am pleased today we were able to unanimously adopt this resolution extending the mandate of UNAMA for another year. As the penholder on Afghanistan file, I would like to express Japan's heartfelt appreciation to all our fellow Council members for their constructive engagement, valuable inputs, and flexibility throughout the negotiation process in order to reach consensus. The resolution we have just adopted ensures that UNAMA will remain equipped with a sufficient, robust, and flexible mandate as it tackles the multifaceted challenges faced by Afghanistan. UNAMA's role is more important than ever in addressing the worsening humanitarian and human rights situation, especially for women and girls. The mission's presence is indispensable as we, the international community, seek to deepen engagement and build confidence with the Taliban as agreed during the Special Envoy's meeting in Doha last month. This resolution will also send a strong message to the people in Afghanistan that the United Nations, backed by the Security Council, will continue to work tirelessly for them, especially those who are in difficult situations. In closing, I'd like to stress that Japan remains committed to provide its full support for UNAMA's role and functions under the leadership of Special Representative Otunbayeva. I also extend our sincere appreciation to the entire UNAMA staff for their dedication for the people of Afghanistan. We look forward to further enhancing cooperation on the ground between UNAMA and our embassy in Kabul. Thank you. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
中方对联大团授权延期
China
决议草
voted
案
in
投了
favor
赞成
of the
票。
draft resolution extending the mandate of the
这
UNAMA.
主要是基于我们对联合国工作的支持，
This is based
对
on
奥通巴耶娃
our
特别代表
support
的支持。
for the work of the United Nations
中
and
方
for
期
the
待联大
special
团在特别代
representative
表女士的带领
Otunbayeva
下， 为促进
China
阿
hopes
富汗
that
的稳
UNAMA
定
under
发
the
展
leadership of
和
Madam
融入地区合作，
Special Representative
为
will
帮助
continue
阿富
to
汗人
play an
民
active role in
开辟
promoting
美好生
Afghanistan's
活
stability,
继续
development,
发
and
挥
integration
建
into
设性的作
regional
用。
cooperation, and in helping the
与此
Afghan
同时
people build a better
我们
life.
对决议草案
At the same
未能
time,
与时俱进
we
地
regret that the
反映
draft
阿富汗问题
resolution
的最
fails
新
to
进展，
reflect the latest
感到
developments
遗
in
憾。
Afghanistan by keeping pace with the times.
外国军队撤出2年半以来，
2.5 years
阿富汗
after
国
the
内局势
withdrawal of
总体
foreign
稳定，
troops, Afghanistan is
经济民
seeing
生
an
得到
overall
改善，
stable domestic
地区
situation,
合作持续扩
improvement
展，
in its economy and people's
同时在
livelihoods,
人道局势、
sustained
经
expansion
济
of
发展、
regional
恐怖
cooperation,
威胁等
while
方
at
面
the same time
依
it
然
still
面临
faces
严峻
severe
的挑战。
challenges in such areas as the humanitarian
国际社
situation,
会
economic
应该同阿
development,
富汗
and
临时政府
territorial
加强
and
接触，
terrorist threat.
一
The
方面
international
要保
community
障
should
对阿富
strengthen
汗的
its
人道援助，
engagement with the Afghan interim
另一方
government,
面要在扫
ensuring
雷、
humanitarian
替代
assistance
种
on the
植、
one hand,
恢
and
复银行
providing
系
more
统、
help in
解
mine
冻海外
clearance,
资产，
alternative development,
保障
restoration of the
全体
banking
人民
system,
权益等方
unfreezing
面
of overall
提供更
assets,
多
and
的帮助。
safeguarding the rights and interests of the entire
执笔
population
国
on
提
the
交的
other.
决议草案
The draft
给人的印
resolution
象是，
submitted by the penholder
2
gives the
年多来
impression that
形势没
the
有任
situation
何
has
变化，
remained unchanged for
这
over
与
2
实际
years,
情况显然是
which
脱
is
节的。
clearly a disconnect with reality.
联阿团自2002年成立以
Since
来，
its
根据
establishment
形
in
势变化，
2002,
多次调整
UNAMA
秘
has,
书
in
长
line
向安
with
理
the
会
changing
报告的周
situation,
期。
made several adjustments of Secretary
考虑到
General's
阿富汗
reporting
安全局势
cycle
总
to
体
the
趋稳，
Security Council. In
中
light
方
of
在
the
此次
overall
磋商中提
stabilization
议
of the security
适
situation in
当
the country,
延
China
长报告的
proposed
周期，
during consultation that the
这
report
并不妨碍安理
reporting
会根据
cycle
需要
be
随时审
extended
议阿
as
富汗问题，
appropriate. Doing that
也
would
绝不
not
意味
prevent
着
the
对阿
Council
富汗
from
人民的
considering the
支持
issue
有
of
任何弱化。
Afghanistan whenever necessary, nor would it
我
in
们总
any
的
way
考虑
imply
是，
any
希
weakening
望
of
安理
support for
会
the
围
Afghan
绕阿
people.
富汗
Our
采取的
overall
行动，
consideration is that we hope
能够符
actions
合
taken
形势
by
的
the
发展，
Security Council with
能够
regard
契
to
合阿富
Afghanistan
汗人民
will
的
be
需要。
in line with the development of the
中方
situation and the
愿继续
needs
就
of
有
the
关
Afghan
问题
people.
同各方
China stands
保
ready
持
to
沟通。
continue to maintain communication with all
谢谢
parties
主
on
席。
relevant issues. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States is deeply committed to supporting the Afghan people, and therefore we are deeply committed to supporting UNAMA. I want to commend the UNAMA staff on the ground in Afghanistan who are performing critically important work under difficult and dangerous conditions, as well as thank Japan for its leadership over the mandate renewal process, which ensures that these efforts will continue. By extending the mandate, this Council has enabled the United Nations to continue addressing the international community's key priorities in Afghanistan, alleviating the country's widespread humanitarian emergency and economic crisis, promoting peace and stability, facilitating dialogue between all relevant Afghan political actors and stakeholders, and supporting efforts to restore the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Afghans, and particularly women and girls, empowering them to participate freely, fully, and meaningfully in every aspect of society. These are worthy efforts every day, and especially today as we celebrate Women's History Month and convene the 68th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. Colleagues, we all have more work to do when it comes to Afghanistan, but today's unanimous vote sends a very strong message. Regarding a UN Special Envoy, we again call on the UN to fully implement Resolution 2721, undertaking consultations and ultimately appointing someone to work with the international community, the Taliban, and Afghans. The Afghan people deserve to see peace, security, and stability, to enjoy human rights and fundamental freedoms. Let us continue to work together to create that reality. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, Российская Федерация
Russian
проголосовала
Federation
сегодня в
voted
поддержку
today in
резолюции
support
Совета
of the Security
Безопасности,
Council resolution,
продлившей
which
мандат
extended the
миссии
mandate of the
ООН по
United Nations
содействию в
mission,
Афганистане на 12
assistance mission in
месяцев.
Afghanistan for a period of 12
Исходим из
months.
того, что
We
установленные
believe that
резолюцией Совета
the
Безопасности
parameters
2626
set out
параметры
in
позволяют
the
миссии
resolution
в полном объеме
2626
осуществлять
allow the
свою
mission
деятельность в
to fully
Афганистане
carry
в
out
критически
its
важный для
operations
страны
in
период.
Afghanistan during a critical period for the
Отмечаем
country.
самоотверженную
We
работу
note the
ООНовского
selfless
персонала в
efforts of UN
Афганистане
personnel
и
in
лично главы
Afghanistan,
МОНСА
as well as
Розы
those
Атунбаевой,
personal
добросовестно
selfless efforts of the
выполняющих
head of
возложенные
UNAMA,
на
Madam
них задачи в непростых
Atunbayeva,
условиях.
who comply with the goals set out for
Убеждены,
them
что
in
последовательная
good faith
поддержка
under
Советом
difficult
Безопасности
circumstances. We believe
усилий
that
ООНовской
consistent support
миссии
from the Security
служит
Council for
сигналом народу
the UN mission
Афганистана
serves as a
об общей
message for the
приверженности
people in
международного
Afghanistan,
сообщества
a message about
установлению
the
долгожданных
commitment of
мира
the
и
international
стабильности
community
в
when it
этой
comes to the
многострадальной
establishment
стране.
of a long-awaited peace and stability in this
Императивом
long-suffering
остается
country. What
сохранение
remains
прагматичного
imperative is
взаимодействия
maintaining
МОНСА
pragmatic
с
cooperation
де-факто
between
властями
UNAMA
для
and the de facto
обсуждения всех
authorities
проблем в
to discuss
соответствии с
all
возложенными
issues
на
in
ООНовцев
line
задачами.
with the goals entrusted and objectives
Приоритетное
entrusted to
значение при этом
United Nations
имеют усилия
personnel.
миссии
A
на
priority
гуманитарном
here
треке и
is
ее
the
способность
efforts of the
выполнять свои
mission on the
обязанности по
humanitarian track,
координации
as well as the
международного
mission's
гумсодействия
ability
стране,
to comply
оказанию
with its
поддержки в
mandate
первую очередь
when it comes to
наиболее
coordination of
уязвимым
international
группам
humanitarian
населения,
assistance to the country,
женщинам,
delivering
детям,
support first and
пожилым и
foremost to the
инвалидам.
most vulnerable population
Это
groups,
особенно
to
важно
women,
с
to
учетом
children,
нерешенности
elderly
вопроса
persons,
с
and persons with
замороженными
disabilities.
активами и
This is particularly
беспрецедентных
important when it
односторонних
comes to the
санкций.
outstanding issue of frozen assets
На
and
этом фоне
unprecedented
не выдерживают
unilateral
никакой критики
sanctions.
попытки
Against this
политизации
backdrop, there
гуманитарной
are
сферы под разными
unjustifiable attempts
предлогами.
to politicize the
На наш
humanitarian
взгляд,
sphere
это
with
аморально
various
и
pretexts being
недопустимо.
advanced. This is both
Вызывает
immoral,
сожаление
immoral, and
неконструктивная позиция
unacceptable in our
отдельных
view.
членов
We
Совета,
regret the
изначально
non-constructive position of
продемонстрировавших
certain
готовность
members
обсуждать
who initially
гуманитарные вызовы
demonstrated a willingness to
исключительно в
discuss
привязке
humanitarian
к ситуации
challenges
с правами человека
exclusively
и
in
отражать в тексте
conjunction with
новые
the human
реалии
rights
лишь в
situation
удобном для них
and their
ключе.
willingness to reflect in the
Такие
text
действия
new
расходятся с
realities
громкими
in
лозунгами
a way
о
that
заботе о
is
простых афганцах,
convenient to
важности
themselves.
нормализации ситуации в
This
стране
runs
и
counter
выстраивания
to the
всеобъемлющего
slogans, their
реалистичного
vociferous
подхода,
slogans about
конечная
concern
цель
for
которого
ordinary Afghan people
международная
and the importance of
реинтеграция
normalizing
Афганистана.
the situation in the country and the establishment of a
Убеждены,
comprehensive
что
realistic approach,
построение
the end goal of which
долгосрочного
is
мира в
international
стране
reintegration of the country.
невозможно без
We believe that
объективной,
the establishment of a
взвешенной
lasting peace in
оценки
the
и
country is only
конструктивного и
possible with an
терпеливого
objective,
взаимодействия
balanced
с
assessment and
де-факто
constructive
властями
and
по
patient
широкому кругу
cooperation
проблем,
with the de
в том
facto
числе под
authorities
эгидой
on a
ООН.
broad range of issues,
Альтернативы
including under
этому
the
пути
aegis
нет.
of the United
От
Nations.
этого
There is
зависит
no
скорый
alternative
выход из
path to this.
сложившегося
This will
тупика и
determine
успешное
the
выполнение МОНСА
end to
возложенных на нее
the
задач.
deadlock
Я
and
благодарю за
successful
внимание.
fulfillment by UNAMA of the goals entrusted to it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Slovenia welcomes the unanimous adoption of the resolution and thanks the penholder Japan for their efforts and all the Council members for their constructive engagement. We welcome that the unity of the Council on such an important topic was attained once again. Slovenia voted in favor of this resolution because we believe UNAMA's mandate must remain comprehensive, support the path towards the inclusive transition and prosperous democratic future of Afghanistan and Afghan people, bringing stability, prosperity, and sustainable peace. With the unanimous extension of UNAMA's mandate, the Council reaffirmed its support for the UN's work in Afghanistan. It is sending an important signal of the international community to Afghan people that we remain committed to protect and stand up for the human rights and to ensure much-needed humanitarian assistance. We welcome and commend UNAMA for all the activities it has been consistently undertaken and implementing its mandate. We particularly stress the importance of UNAMA's work in the fields of human rights, humanitarian assistance, and continued political dialogue with the Taliban. Mr. President, the situation in Afghanistan remains deeply alarming, particularly when it comes to human rights, the dire humanitarian and fragile economic situation, as well as the challenging security threats. All have a devastating impact on the people of Afghanistan. We remain deeply concerned about the policies and practices put in force by the Taliban that restrict the full enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms of women and girls. We regret that the Council members were not able to reflect this in the resolution. Therefore, we once again call on Taliban to respect and fulfill Afghanistan's obligations pursuant to the binding human rights treaties. We remain committed to the people of Afghanistan and reaffirm our solidarity with them. We will continue advocating for human rights for everyone. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to begin by commending Japan and your team's constructive efforts in enabling the necessary extension of UNAMA's mandate through the Council's unanimous decision. UNAMA remains one of the UN's largest special political mission with over 1,000 staff. This size reflects the full scale and seriousness of the multifaceted and interlinked challenge that Afghanistan continues to face. UNAMA's continued presence on the ground and the Security Council's ongoing vigilance on the Afghanistan file are critical to serve the 44 million population of Afghanistan among those 23.7 million in need. We reaffirm our full support UNAMA's strengthened role in coordinating and facilitating the provision of humanitarian assistance in line with the international law and the humanitarian principles. Mr. President, the new school year starts soon in Afghanistan. Yet, 1.4 million girls have been excluded from secondary education. The Republic of Korea stands with the women and girls of Afghanistan who continue to endure the systematic oppression targeting them, remaining deprived of human rights and the fundamental freedoms. We use words like continue or remain, but this status quo is not static. The status quo is exacerbating the sufferings of the Afghan people day by day, and we should never get used to this. We are at critical juncture for initiating in-depth discussion on a long-term roadmap for the reintegration of Afghanistan to the international community. In this course, the needs and aspirations of the Afghan people should always be the main rationale behind our consideration. Before closing, as a country from the region, a major donor and a long-standing supporter of the people of Afghanistan, Korea pays tribute to UNAMA, other UN agencies, and NGOs in Afghanistan for their tireless work. We look forward to holding the next quarterly briefing from UNAMA's as the Council Presidency in June. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Ecuador
voted in favor of this resolution because we believe the work of UNAMA is essential for supporting the Afghan people, and because the mandate contained in Resolution 2626 is robust and comprehensive. We believe that the unity in the Council and unanimous support for the UN agencies working in this country are absolutely essential for addressing the growing humanitarian needs in Afghanistan and in order to reverse the regrettable situation of women and girls, Afghan women and girls who've been restricted in their access to their fundamental freedoms and rights. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this meeting and for leading the Council's efforts to maintain global peace and security. We deeply appreciate the unanimous agreement of the United Nations Security Council to renew UNAMA's mandate in Afghanistan. We fully support UNAMA's vital role in the country and commend Japan for facilitating the adoption of today's resolution. This renewal is critical as Afghanistan faces a severe crisis, exacerbated by the Taliban's lack of commitment and failure to address the situation, engage constructively, and establish a just, responsible, inclusive, and representative system of governance. The system must respect human rights and ensure women's inclusion as promised to the world and the people of Afghanistan. We are pleased that today's resolution highlights UNAMA's crucial role in promoting peace, stability, and inclusive governance in Afghanistan, particularly in monitoring and reporting on human rights, including the situation of women and girls. We thank all international partners for their firm support for Afghan women and girls during the recent Commission on the Status of Women meetings. We urge continued unity and consensus in the international community's principled engagement with Afghanistan to guide the country toward stability. We are grateful to the Special Representative of Secretary General and the UNAMA team for their unwavering efforts in challenging circumstances. Looking ahead, stabilizing Afghanistan and reintegrating it into the international system requires a legitimate, inclusive, and representative governance system based on the justice, the rule of law, and the will of the people that responds to the needs and concerns of the Afghan people and the international community. We hope the UN's focus on political dialogue remains a priority alongside other aspects of UNAMA's mandate. In closing, we thank all Council members for renewing UNAMA's mandate and for their continued support for the Afghan people, especially women and girls. Your support is crucial for lasting peace in a united and inclusive Afghanistan. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Afghanistan for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. The 9,500 178th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Estonia, Italy, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General of Political and Peace-Building Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with the Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. The principle of respect for territorial integrity and the political independence of states is the cornerstone of our collective security. Any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. Yet, that is what the Russian Federation has attempted in Ukraine, causing in the process unspeakable suffering and destruction. This bears repeating, as tomorrow will mark 10 years since the unlawful attempt by the Russian Federation to annex the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol through a so-called referendum. The position of the United Nations on the status of Crimea is guided by the General Assembly resolution on the territorial integrity of Ukraine of 27 March 2014. This resolution states that Russia's attempted illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, is invalid and unrecognized by the international community. Also, it has been more than a year since the Russian Federation's equally unlawful effort to annex the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine in September 2022. Just days later, on 12 October 2022, the General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted the resolution entitled Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, Defending the Principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The resolution unequivocally condemns Russia's organization of illegal referenda within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and its attempted annexation of these regions of Ukraine. It also declared that these actions, quote, have no validity under international law and do not form the basis for any alteration of the status of these regions of Ukraine, end quote. In this context, Russia's intention to conduct presidential elections from today, 15 March, until 17 March in areas of Ukraine under its control are unacceptable. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has documented that past so-called referenda and local elections have been conducted in a coercive environment. Under international humanitarian law, the occupying power, in this case the Russian Federation, is obligated to uphold the laws of Ukraine in the occupied territories. Mr. President, international humanitarian law also prohibits indiscriminate attacks and attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. But since February 2022, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified 10,703 civilians, including 594 children killed. 2,146 more civilians, including 1,316 children, have been injured. The actual toll is very likely much higher. Since our last briefing to this Council only a week ago, Russian strikes on civilians and civilian infrastructure have continued unabated. On 12 March, 5 people were reportedly killed and nearly 50 injured, including several children, in a Russian missile strike in Kryvyi Rih in the Dnipropetrovsk region of Ukraine. In Odessa, Russian drone and missile strikes have continued. This morning, 20 people were reportedly killed and 73 injured in a Russian missile strike in the city. 2 of the killed were first responders who died after a second strike hit the location where they had rushed to help victims. Attacks have also continued to damage civilian infrastructure in Odessa, with 25 drones reportedly targeting the city in just one overnight attack on Monday. Less visible is the traumatizing effect of living in constant fear of sudden violent death, injury, or loss. The mental scars left by such dread on countless Ukrainians may take generations to heal. The war in Ukraine has awakened another kind of fear, one that haunts us all. The International Atomic Energy Agency continues to report explosions and other indications of military activity near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We again stress the imperative of ensuring the integrity, safety, and security of all nuclear sites. In this context, we reiterate there is no excuse for irresponsible and inflammatory nuclear rhetoric that fans the risk of further escalation. Mr. President, as highlighted last week by the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine remains dire amid the intensification of aerial assaults by Russian forces. The most vulnerable, including internally displaced persons and those residing in frontline communities, are in urgent need of assistance. Sustaining the donor support to the UN Humanitarian Response Plan is imperative to alleviate the suffering of those affected by the conflict. Despite our persistent efforts, humanitarian access to the Russian-occupied territories remains restricted, raising grave concerns for the well-being of civilians residing in these areas. Mr. President, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has been on the ground for 10 years to monitor and report on human rights violations, including in occupied Crimea. In Crimea, OHCHR has consistently reported on the unlawful imposition of Russian citizenship and laws, intimidation and pressure to participate in illegal electoral processes, suppression of freedom of expression and religion, and other human rights violations. Similar patterns of violations are emerging in the occupied regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. Since December 2023, our human rights colleagues have recorded a disturbing increase in reports of allegations of extrajudicial executions of prisoners of war by Russian forces. As of today, OHCHR has verified 3 cases of execution of 7 Ukrainian POWs, while an additional 9 cases of alleged executions involving at least 25 Ukrainian POWs are still being verified. OHCHR has also documented a pattern of arbitrary detentions and possible enforced disappearance of local officials, journalists, civil society activists, and other civilians at the hands of Russian armed forces in occupied areas of Ukraine. A new report by the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which was published today, provides additional information on the Commission's previous findings that torture against civilians by Russian authorities in Ukraine and in the Russian Federation has been widespread and systematic. victims' accounts disclose relentless, brutal treatment, inflicting severe pain and suffering during prolonged detention with blatant disregard for human dignity. This has led to long-lasting physical and mental trauma. All perpetrators of such egregious violations must be held accountable. We will support efforts to this end by continuing to record these cases and to implore the Russian Federation to facilitate access to all detainees. Mr. President, as this war is now in its third year, peace continues to elude us. The rising toll of the war on the people of Ukraine is undeniable. Furthermore, as reiterated during the ongoing 68th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, conflicts worldwide, including in Ukraine, have an acute impact on the lives of women. Women constitute the vast majority of the 6.2 million people forced to flee their homes during the war, which jeopardizes the strides made toward gender equality and exacerbates existing inequalities. Despite immense obstacles, Ukrainian women have been at the forefront of humanitarian initiatives. Women-led civil society groups were among the earliest responders to the full-scale invasion. And it is crucial to recognize the essential role Ukrainian women must assume in the long process to recovery and peaceful future of Ukraine. The pursuit of peace must be our foremost priority, guided by the UN Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. The Secretary General's remarks to this Council on 23 February aptly underscored the imperative of recommitting to these fundamental principles to achieve just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I want to thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing. Mr. President, let me focus on three messages on today's topic. First, let me start with an undisputed fact, and that is that these days Russia is organizing presidential elections not just on its own territory, but also on the territory of another sovereign member of the United Nations, against the will of that country. Slovenia denounces the attempted illegal annexation and subsequent holding of Russian elections on Ukrainian territory. Russia calls parts of Ukraine it has seized the new territories. This reflects a colonial logic of an age-long past. Annexation amounts to an act of aggression. It is forbidden by international law and goes against purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Second, what is the outlook for peace in Ukraine in the context of these elections? We have serious doubts in the sincerity of the Russian claims towards its openness for peace talks. Holding elections in the illegally seized territories does not signal readiness for diplomacy. It rather demonstrates an intention to continue to pursue its agenda with military might. Its renewed nuclear weapons rhetoric is worrisome and simply unacceptable under any circumstances. Peace needs to come to Ukraine, and we have hopes for a peace process to materialize soon, and we call on Russia to cease with its belligerent narrative and demonstrate it really wants peace. Third, speaking of elections where they can be legally held, that is in the internationally recognized territory of Russia, we are disappointed that contrary to its commitments as an OSCE participant state, for the first time Russia decided not to invite OSCE observers to its presidential elections. We regret that the country's voters will be deprived of this instrument of impartial and independent assessment of their elections. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start by thanking Undersecretary General DiCarlo for briefing us on the current situation in Ukraine. Ukraine's temporarily occupied territory and Ukraine, who called and is here for this critical meeting. I want to start by condemning Russia's devastating missile attacks on Odessa today, attacks that left at least 14 people dead and dozens more wounded. This violence is unconscionable, and it is inextricably linked with the matter we are here to discuss: sham presidential elections in Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories. For those who have questions about Russia's intentions in Ukraine, there's an old saying you may have heard before. Once is a fluke, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is a pattern. Now, I wouldn't exactly describe Russia's 2014 invasion of Ukraine, purported annexation of Crimea, and sham referendum a fluke. Nor do I believe that the sham Russian presidential elections held there 4 years later is a coincidence. Both of these illegitimate acts were cynical attempts by the Kremlin to legitimize Putin's illegal attempt at a land grab. But today, as early voting for the Russian elections enters final days, this much is clear. Russia's tactics of holding sham elections in Ukraine's occupied territory is, in fact, a pattern. Colleagues, as we speak, Russia's Central Election Commission continues to conduct presidential elections not only in the Russian Federation, but throughout the parts of sovereign Ukraine that it occupies and has purported to annex: Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea. Let's call this what it is. It's a blatant propaganda exercise undertaken in the hopes of somehow strengthening Russia's false claim to the parts of Ukraine it illegally invaded. To hold Russian elections in Ukraine's sovereign territory is proof of the tie between the Kremlin's external aggression and internal repression. It is an affront to the UN's Charter principles that underpin global security and stability, and it demonstrates the Kremlin's disregard for this institution and for international law, further proving that Russia has little intention of seeking a peace settlement based on UN Charter principles. And so 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and 10 since its initial invasion of Crimea, we must continue to defend Ukraine's sovereignty. UN members need not agree on everything to stand together and stand up for a simple tenet: holding elections in another sovereign UN member state's territory without its consent is in manifest disregard for the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Any country that purports to defend these principles must not be silent now. For our part, the United States has sanctioned several individuals for acts supporting Russia's war, including those involved in the unlawful transfer of deportation of Ukrainian children. And we, along with other partners, have imposed sanctions on those responsible for the death of Alexei Navalny, including the prison warden, regional prison head, and deputy director of the Federal Penitentiary Service in Russia. Now we call on the international community to join us in imposing costs on those responsible for organizing and holding these sham elections in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. We also call on so-called election observers to resist exploitation and refrain from legitimizing this process. The United States is not aware of any internationally respected election observation organization planning to oversee these elections. Anyone propped up by the Kremlin to lend a flimsy veneer of legitimacy is simply a pawn in their game. Colleagues, the United States will never recognize the Russian Federation's claim to any of Ukraine's sovereign territory, and we unequivocally condemn Russia's continued occupation of part of Ukraine. Now it is critical that we continue to stand together in support of the UN Charter and against Russia's territorial ambitions and efforts to redraw borders by force, that we continue to call for accountability for the atrocities and the abuses committed by Russian officials in Ukraine, that we continue to seek justice for victims, not only as a moral imperative, but as a strategic one, furthering deterrence and respect for the rule of law in the future, and that we continue to condemn the sham election in Ukraine's temporarily occupied territory for what it is, one in a pattern of failed attempts to justify the unjustifiable. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
我感谢迪卡洛副秘
I
书长
thank
的通
Under-Secretary
报。
General DiCarlo for her briefing.
俄乌战事爆发，
It
乌
has
克兰
been
危
more
机全
than
面
2
升
years
级，
since
至
the
今已
total
经有2
escalation
年
of
多
the
了。
Ukrainian crisis and the
2
breakout
年
of the
多的时间里，
Russian-Ukrainian
我们
conflict.
看到了
In
太
the
多
course
的
of more
生
than
灵
2
涂炭，
years, we have seen too much
看到了
misery
太多的
and too many
人间
human
惨剧。
tragedies unfolded.
在这个大厅
In
里，
this
我们也
very
听到了
chamber,
太多
we
的
have
悲
also
愤和呼
heard
吁。
too much expression of
劝
grief and
说
pain,
和激
appeals
辩。
and persuasion, and heated
目前
debate.
战火
With the
仍在
fighting
延宕，
still ongoing,
外溢风
the
险
risk of
持续显
spillover
现。
continues to emerge.
多一天冲突，
One more day of
世界
conflict
就多一分
brings
风
one
险。
more element of risk to the
早一
world.
天和谈，
One day
和平
earlier
就
for
早一
peace
天到来。
talks means one day sooner for
实现和
peace.
平
Peace
是当务之
is
急，
a matter of
也
utmost
是众望所
urgency,
归。
as well as a matter of public
在乌克兰
expectation.
问题上，
On the
中方
question of
始终主
Ukraine,
张，
China has
各
always
国主
maintained
权、领土
that the
完整
sovereignty and the
都应
territorial
该得到
integrity
尊
of
重。
all countries should be
联合
respected,
国宪章
that
宗
the
旨和
purposes
原
and
则
principles of
都
the
应该
UN
得到
Charter
遵守。
be upheld,
各国
that
合
the
理安全关
legitimate
切
security
都应
concerns
该得
of
到
all
重视，
countries be taken into
一
account,
切有利于和平解
and
决
that
危
all
机的努
efforts
力
conducive
都
to
应
a
该得到支持。
political resolution of the crisis be supported.
我们再次呼
We
吁冲突
reiterate
当
our
事方
call on the
展现
parties to
政
the
治意
conflict
愿，
to
相
demonstrate
向而
political
行，
will, move
凝聚
towards
共
each
识，
other, build
早日停
consensus,
火止战，
cease fighting,
开
and
启和
start
谈。
peace talks at an early date.
呼吁国际
We
社会
call on
加
the
大外交
international
斡旋，
community to step
为
up
推动
its
局势
diplomatic
缓和、
efforts to create
实现政
conditions
治解决
for
创造条件。
de-escalating the situation and achieving a political settlement.
中方始终秉持
China
客观
has
公
always
正立场，
maintained an
坚持
objective
劝
and
和促
impartial
谈。
position and has persisted
近
in
日，
promoting
中国政
peace
府
and
欧亚事务
negotiation.
特别代
Recently,
表
the special
访问了
representative
俄
of
罗
the
斯、
Chinese government
乌克兰、
on
欧
Eurasian
盟、
affairs visited
波
Russia,
兰、
Ukraine, the
德
EU,
国、
Poland, Germany,
法
and
国。
France, where
就政治
he
解决乌克兰
engaged
危
in an
机，同
in-depth
相关各
exchange of
方深
views
入
with
交换意
relevant
见，
parties on the political
穿梭
settlement
斡
of the
旋，
Ukrainian crisis,
传递
carried
信
out
息。
shuttle mediation
我们
and
支持
relayed
适时
messages
召
and
开俄
information.
乌双
We
方认
support
可、
the holding in due
各
course
方
of an
平等
international
参与，
peace conference that
对
is
所有和平
recognized
方
by
案
both
进
Russia and
行
Ukraine,
公平
and
讨
one
论的
that
国际
ensures
和
the
会。
equal participation of all parties in the fair discussion of all
中
peace
方愿为
plans.
俄乌双方开
China
展
is
谈
ready
判，
to provide
提
the
供必要
necessary
条件，
conditions for Russia and Ukraine to
继续为
engage
推
in
动危机的政治
negotiations,
解决
and will
发
continue to
挥
play a
建设
constructive
性作
role
用。
in promoting a political solution to the
谢谢主席。
crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting. Let me also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for the valuable information provided in her briefing. I welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, as we convene in another deliberative session on the conflict in Ukraine, Sierra Leone makes the point of reiterating our call for the full respect of the United Nations Charter, its principles, including the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of its member states, in this case, Ukraine, within its internationally recognized borders. In this regard, we express serious concern regarding the decision to hold an external electoral exercise scheduled for 15 to 17 March 2024 in the annexed regions within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. We are of the firm view that such actions are not in tandem with the principles of the United Nations Charter, in particular the principle evinced in Article 2, Paragraph 4, and has serious implications on the peaceful resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. On 29 September 2022, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia region of Ukraine were unilaterally declared as part of the Russian Federation after the conduct of disputed referenda. In this regard, we wish to recall UN General Assembly Resolution ES 11.4, which noted that Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine are areas that, in part, are or have been under the temporary military control of the Russian Federation in violation of the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We also take note of the previous General Assembly resolutions, including 62/262, which also address the referendum held in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and the call for non-recognition of any alteration of their status on the basis of the referendum. The UN General Assembly, in its resolution 2625 of 24 October 1970, in approving the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, we affirmed and restated the customary international law principle that, and I quote, the territory of a state shall not be the object of acquisition by another state resulting from the threat or use of force, and that any attempt aimed at the partial or total disruption of the national unity and territorial integrity of a state or country or at its political independence is incompatible with the purposes and principles of the Charter, end of quote. In this context, we also recall Security Council Resolution 2202, reaffirming its full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Premised on the above, Sierra Leone agrees and aligns itself with the Secretary General's statement of 29 September 2022, in which we recall that any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the principles of the Charter and international law. Mr. President, Sierra Leone firmly believes in upholding the fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter, particularly those related to respecting the territorial integrity and political independence of all member states, and call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And this includes the holding of external elections in the annexed regions of Ukraine. Sierra Leone also places high premium on the UN Charter provision for parties in a dispute to settle such dispute by peaceful means. Accordingly, we urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict, addressing the legitimate concerns of the parties to the conflict. We further urge the parties to refrain from taking actions that reduces the chances of a diplomatic solution. Sierra Leone remains steadfast in its support for efforts that contribute to peace, stability, and security in the region. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating a call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and a peaceful resolution of the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. I welcome the participation of the Ukraine, Italy, Poland, Romania, EU, and Estonia delegation at today's meeting. From the very beginning of Russia's armed invasion of Ukraine, the international community, including my own country, has repeatedly condemned these actions and demanded the withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine. When Russia illegally annexed the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson in September 2022, the UN General Assembly, with the support of a majority of member states, adopted Resolution ES 11/4, declaring that Russia's annexation has no validity under international law and demanding a reversal of its decision. Yet, Russia has not heeded the recurrent international calls to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the contrary, Russia has continued and expanded its brutal war against Ukraine, causing devastating consequences with indescribable human sufferings, particularly for women and children in Ukraine, alongside grave global repercussions. In this troubling situation, we are now witnessing Russian presidential elections taking place in the occupied territories of Ukraine. The Republic of Korea reiterates the Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence should be respected. The principle of the prohibition of the use of force represent the beating heart of the UN Charter and has served as a fundamental norm of international law over the last 7 decades. Indeed, as the prominent international lawyer Louis Hackin presciently pointed out more than 50 years ago, we have every reason to keep alive this precious principle at all costs. He argued that this principle serves national interests and thereby has deterring effects against the major wars among countries. And the importance of upholding this principle was pronounced, particularly when UN and the international community firmly responded to the DPRK armed aggression against the Republic of Korea in 1950. Needless to say, the role of the permanent member of the Security Council as the ultimate guardians of international peace and security is critical in defending this golden rule. Tragically, in addition to breaching the UN Charter, Russia's illegal invasion has dealt a serious blow to other fundamental values that the international community has been upholding. The war it is waging against Ukraine has caused continuing violation of international humanitarian and humanitarian rights laws. In its war of aggression, Russia has even procured DPRK's weapons, including ballistic missiles, in clear violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions, undermining the global non-proliferation regime. International law and the UN Charter is our last bastion to ensure the maintenance of international peace and security, which is something Russia also benefits from. In this regard, my delegation once again urges Russia to live up to its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Security Council by promptly withdrawing its military forces from territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Any attempts to change international borders by force, if successful, will have cascading effects. This would prompt similar attempts everywhere else, thus enabling might to prevail over justice. The Republic of Korea, which has proud history of both defending and rebuilding its nation alongside the UN, will continue to stand with Ukraine and its people in their noble endeavors toward a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace within their territories in line with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la señora
I would like
Rosemary
to thank
DiCarlo,
Ms. Rosemary
secretaria general
DiCarlo,
adjunta de Asuntos Políticos y
USG for
Consolidación de la
Political and
Paz,
Peacebuilding
por su
Affairs,
exposición informativa.
for her informative briefing.
La normativa internacional es clara
International law
en
is
cuanto a la
clear with
ilegitimidad que
respect
tiene
to
la
the
realización de elecciones en
illegitimate
territorios
nature of
ocupados
holding
militarmente.
elections in militarily
El
occupied
Ecuador hace un
territories.
llamado a evitar
Ecuador
acciones que
calls
puedan
for
impactar
actions to be avoided,
negativamente
which
el
could
ya
have a
tenso
negative
panorama en la
impact
región
on the
y
already
debilite los
tense
esfuerzos
situation in the region
internacionales para
and
encontrar una salida
undermine
pacífica
international efforts
y
to find
diplomática
a
al conflicto.
peaceful and diplomatic outcome
Vale la
to the
pena
conflict.
recordar
It is
que el
worthwhile
12 de
recalling
octubre
that
del
already
2022
back on
la comunidad
October
internacional
12,
ya se pronunció con
2022,
una voz
a
firme
united
y
international
unificada a través de
community
la
spoke out
resolución
firmly
ES
through UN
11/4
resolution
de la que la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas, evidenciando el consenso global sobre la ilegitimidad de los referendos realizados en territorio ucraniano. En ese sentido, ha resultado preocupante conocer sobre la decisión de las autoridades rusas de llevar a cabo elecciones presidenciales en los territorios temporalmente ocupados de Ucrania, en particular la República Autónoma de Crimea y la ciudad de Sebastopol, así como las partes regionales ucranianas de Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporilla y Kherson. Desde su fundación como república, el Ecuador ha rechazado y condenado el uso de la fuerza de un Estado contra otro, en línea con los principios de su política exterior y honrando su vocación pacífica, no reconoce la adquisición de territorios por la fuerza. Esta posición de principio es y será invariable. De la misma forma, el Ecuador cree firmemente que las controversias deben resolverse por medios pacíficos, enmarcados en los mecanismos establecidos por la Carta Fundacional de esta organización. Señor Presidente,
Mr. President,
La crisis en Ucrania persiste
the crisis
y las
in
tensiones
Ukraine
en la región continúan escalando, haciendo
persists
cada
and
vez más
tensions in the
evidente la
region
necesidad de
continue to
actuar de manera
escalate.
decisiva.
It is increasingly evident
El
that
Ecuador
decisive
reitera
action
su
is
llamado a
needed.
Rusia
Ecuador
para que
reiterates
suspenda
its appeal
inmediatamente
to
las
Russia
operaciones
immediately
militares
to suspend
e
its
insiste en
military
la necesidad de que
operations,
este Consejo
and we insist on the
priorice
need
la
for this
utilización
Council to
efectiva de los
prioritize the
mecanismos de
effective
mediación
use of
disponibles bajo
mediation
la Carta de las
mechanisms
Naciones Unidas, a
provided
fin de
for in the
facilitar
UN
un cese de
Charter in
hostilidades
order to
y la
facilitate a
restauración de la
cessation of
paz.
hostilities and the
La
restoration of
situación en
peace.
Ucrania, debido a su complejidad,
Given the complexity
no
of the
admite
situation in
soluciones
Ukraine,
simplistas.
there are no
A
easy
pesar de los
solutions.
obstáculos y las
Despite the
complejidades,
obstacles and
no
the
debemos perder la esperanza de
complexities, we
alcanzar una
must
paz
not
justa y
lose
duradera,
hope in
enmarcada en lo
achieving a
establecido por la
just and
Carta de las
lasting
Naciones
peace
Unidas.
pursuant to
Este
the UN
Consejo,
Charter.
en
This
su calidad de
Council,
custodio
as the
principal de la
primary
paz y
guarantor
la seguridad
of international
internacionales,
peace and
debe
security,
trabajar hacia ese
must
fin.
work toward that
Muchas
end.
gracias.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, we thank you for convening this briefing. We also thank USG DiCarlo for her update. Mr. President, free and fair elections are indeed a cornerstone of any democratic system, allowing citizens to exercise their fundamental human rights, to choose their own leaders and have a voice in how they are governed. These are commonly accepted international principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and other international human rights instruments. While the act of holding elections within a country is a domestic affair, its implications extend far beyond national borders. Understanding the broader context and ensuring fair and transparent processes are equally vital. The current context is crystal clear. The conflict levels between Russia and Ukraine is at the highest possible point, posing a serious threat to local, regional, and international peace and security. As we have consistently reminded, international efforts are crucial to prevent further escalation and protect civilian lives. This is happening against consistent and repeated calls from various actors, including by the members of this Council, for the cessation of hostilities. Based on our own experience in Mozambique, we were adamant from the outset of this conflict there can be no military solution. This holds true after 2 years and more of conflict. Mr. President, as we can see, the global impact of this war continues to intensify, worsening multiple crises related to food insecurity, energy access, and more. Its consequences transcend borders and threaten our collective security. We call the parties to immediately cease all military operations and engage in good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve this conflict peacefully in line with the UN Charter. Let us explore all available avenues, including those enshrined in the UN Charter, to build confidence and set the ground for direct, constructive, and result-oriented dialogue. Mr. President, this Council has a moral obligation to uphold its founding purpose of preventing and removing threats to international peace and security. Inaction is not an option. We must intensify our efforts through all available means to facilitate a resolution to this conflict in line with the UN Charter and the international law. Dialogue between the contending parties is possible. Let us build upon this foundation and seek paths towards mutual understanding. In the spirit of determined diplomacy, we once again urge the parties to reconsider their choices and opt for the path of dialogue and diplomacy before more lives are tragically lost. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie la secrétaire générale adjointe Rosemary DiCarlo pour son intervention. La Charte des Nations Unies nous engage toutes et tous à respecter la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale des États. Elle établit également l'impératif de s'abstenir de recourir à la force. Ces principes constituent les piliers indispensables de notre ordre international et sont censés favoriser les relations pacifiques entre les États. Toute annexion du territoire d'un État par un autre État résultant de la menace et de l'usage de force constitue une violation de ces principes fondamentaux du droit international. La situation en Ukraine nous rappelle de manière flagrante les répercussions du non-respect de ces principes. 10 ans se sont écoulés depuis le soi-disant référendum en Crimée et 1 an et demi depuis que la Russie a répété cette action illégale dans les régions de Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk et Saporicha, alors que la guerre faisait et fait rage, comme nous l'avons avec tristesse encore constaté aujourd'hui à Odessa. Je prends cette occasion pour présenter mes très sincères condoléances aux familles des victimes et au gouvernement d'Ukraine. L'annexion des territoires ukrainiens déclarée par la Russie à la suite de ces votes constitue une grave violation du droit international, notamment de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine. Nous insistons sur le fait que ces régions sont et resteront partie intégrante de l'Ukraine. La Suisse réitère son engagement en faveur de la souveraineté, de l'indépendance et de l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine. La Suisse condamne la décision de la Russie d'organiser de prétendues élections présidentielles dans les territoires occupés de l'Ukraine qui se poursuivent en ce moment même. La tenue de ces prétendues élections en territoire occupé constitue une violation du droit international et le résultat n'a aucune légitimité. La Suisse ne reconnaîtra ni les résultats des soi-disant élections menées dans les territoires, ni l'incorporation des territoires ukrainiens à la Fédération de Russie. Nous demandons d'ailleurs instamment à la Russie de cesser toutes les hostilités et de retirer ses troupes du territoire ukrainien. Monsieur le Président, avec une grande majorité de l'Assemblée générale, la Suisse a soutenu la résolution ES 11/4 sur l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine. Cette résolution demande à tous les États et à toutes les organisations internationales de ne reconnaître aucune modification par la Russie du statut des territoires ukrainiens et à s'abstenir de toute action qui pourrait être interprétée comme une telle reconnaissance. Cet appel revêt une importance particulière en ces jours. Tant que ces territoires demeurent sous occupation, la Russie est tenue de respecter ses obligations lui incombant en tant que puissance occupante en vertu du droit international humanitaire. Elle est notamment obligée de respecter l'ordre juridique ukrainien existant. Nous sommes profondément préoccupés par le non-respect actuel de ces obligations et par les violations récurrentes, graves et systématiques des droits humains et du droit humanitaire, comme le souligne le dernier rapport de la Commission d'enquête internationale indépendante sur l'Ukraine et le rapport du Haut-Commissariat aux droits de l'homme sur les 10 années d'occupation de la Crimée. Nous saluons la Commission d'enquête et la mission de surveillance des droits de l'homme en Ukraine pour leur travail. Nous rappelons que le respect strict du droit international et des droits de l'homme est impératif en tout temps. Cela comprend l'obligation de permettre et de faciliter le passage rapide et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire destinée aux civils dans le besoin, y compris dans les zones occupées. Pour conclure, je souligne que l'organisation de soi-disant processus électoraux dans les zones occupées de l'Ukraine compromet encore davantage les perspectives de paix. Ce dont nous avons besoin, ce sont des États décisifs vers une paix globale, juste et durable en Ukraine, conformément à la Charte des Nations Unies. Mon pays demeure pleinement engagé dans la réalisation de cet objectif. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Under-Secretary General DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing. As we have stated before, Malta deplores Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We recall that the General Assembly condemned the organization by the Russian Federation of illegal so-called referendums and the attempted illegal annexation of the Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine in 2022. Similarly, as from 2014, the General Assembly called on states not to recognize any alteration of the status of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Russia's planned presidential elections in these regions this weekend and the reported mail voting processes taking place in some areas since 25th February further manifest this violation of international law. We reiterate our call on Russia to respect the principles of the UN Charter and to reverse these illegal plans. Holding such elections grossly violates the constitution and legislation of Ukraine. They have no validity under international law and do not form the basis of any alteration of the status of Ukraine's territories. We will not recognize either the holding of these so-called, in quotes, elections or their results. There have been also reports of Russian officials carrying ballot boxes from house to house in Zaporizhzhia, implementing intimidation tactics, as well as pressuring Ukrainians who have not done so to take up Russian citizenship. We condemn these acts, including illegal referendums, illegal population census, forcible change of the democratic structure of the population, and the eradication of national identity. President, we deplore the loss of life and suffering, especially in temporarily occupied territories. The inhabitants of these regions have been subjected to violations of their human rights and basic freedoms. International monitoring mechanisms, such as the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission Ukraine and the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, have confirmed Russia's breaches of international humanitarian law and international human rights law inside Ukraine. These violations encompass attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, systematic summary executions, instances of torture and ill treatment, inhumane detention conditions, cases of rape, sexual and gender-based violence, as well as the forced transfer and deportation of children. All are unacceptable. We recall our demand to the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations as an occupying power under international humanitarian law. President, finally, Malta expresses its determination to continue working together within the International Crimea platform to address the challenges stemming from Russia's temporary occupation of Crimea. We recognize the need to continue implementing the policy of non-recognition of the illegal annexations by Russia. We cannot accept a world where these principles and rules are violated with impunity. We cannot accept a world in which might is right. We cannot accept a world which nuclear threats are the norm. We support Ukraine in the exercise of its inherent right of self-defense and to regain full control of all occupied territories within its internationally recognized borders. The only path to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is for Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine and respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame Di Carlo pour sa présentation. La Russie organise une nouvelle fois des pseudo-élections dans les territoires qu'elle occupe illégalement en Ukraine. C'est une mascarade. Même titre que les pseudo-élections d'octobre dernier et que les simulacres de référendum de septembre 2022. Elle cherche de nouveau à donner un semblant de légitimité
It is
à ces
attempting
tentatives
yet again
d'annexion
to give a
illégale.
semblance of legitimacy
Cette
to its
manœuvre
illegal
ne
attempts at
changera pas la
annexation.
réalité.
These maneuvers will
Les
not
régions de
change
Luhansk,
reality. The regions of
Donetsk,
Luhansk,
Kherson
Donetsk,
et Zaporizhzhia,
Kherson, and
comme la
Zaporizhzhia,
République autonome de
as
Crimée et
well
la
as
ville de
the Autonomous
Sébastopol,
Republic of Crimea
font
and the city of
partie intégrante
Sevastopol
de
are an
l'Ukraine.
integral part of Ukraine.
La France condamne l'organisation
France
illégale
condemns the
par la
illegal
Russie
holding
de
by
scrutins
Russia
dans
of
ces
elections
territoires.
in these
Les
territories.
votes organisés
These
illégalement
elections
par la puissance
organized
occupante
illegally by an
ne
occupying
représentent pas
power
l'expression
do
de la
not
volonté
represent
libre du
the
peuple
free
ukrainien.
expression of will of the
Monsieur le
Ukrainian
Président,
people.
le 12
Mr.
octobre
President,
2022,
On the 12th of
l'Assemblée
October
générale des Nations Unies a
2022, the UN
condamné,
General
je
Assembly
cite,
condemned, and I quote,
l'organisation par la
the
Russie de
organization
soi-disant
by
référendums
Russia of
illégaux
so-called
dans
illegal
des régions
referenda
situées à l'intérieur
in
des frontières
regions
internationalement reconnues de
situated
l'Ukraine
within the
et la
internationally
tentative
recognized
d'annexion
borders of
illégale
Ukraine
des
and
régions
the
ukrainiennes de
illegal
Luhansk, de
attempts to
Donetsk,
annex
de
the
Kherson
Ukrainian regions
et
of
de
Luhansk,
Zaporijia qui a
Donetsk,
suivi.
Kherson,
Fin
and
de citation.
Zaporizhia, which followed.
En
End
2014,
quote. In
l'Assemblée générale
2014, the
avait
General
déjà
Assembly
décidé que les
had
référendums
already
organisés par la
determined
Russie
that referenda
dans la
organized
République
by
autonome de
Russia in the
Crimée
autonomous
et la
Republic
ville de
of Crimea and the
Sébastopol
city of
n'étaient pas
Sevastopol
valables
were not
et ne
valid
pouvaient
and could
servir
not
de base à une
serve as a
quelconque
basis for any
modification du statut de
change
cette
in the
région.
status of this region.
Les Nations Unies se sont
The
exprimées pour
United
rejeter
Nations spoke
ces
out and
simulacres d'élections
rejected these sham
organisés
elections
contre la volonté des
organized
autorités
contrary to the
légitimes
will
de
of the
Kiev
legitimate
et
authorities
ces
of Kiev
tentatives
and
d'annexion
these
illégales.
illegal attempts
Soyons
at
clairs, il s'agit
annexation.
d'une
Let us
nouvelle
be clear,
violation
this is yet
flagrante
another
de la
flagrant
Charte des Nations
violation
Unies
of the
par la
UN
Russie,
Charter by
d'un
Russia,
nouvel
and
exemple
yet
de son
another
mépris
example
pour les
of
principes
its contempt for
fondamentaux
the
auxquels
founding
nous croyons,
principles in which we
notamment la
believe,
souveraineté
namely
et l'intégrité
the
territoriale
sovereignty and
des États.
territorial integrity of states.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
nous ne nous
President,
résoudrons jamais à ce que la
we will
Russie
never
modifie le statut de région
recognize
ukrainienne,
Russia's
que
attempts
ce
to
soit par
modify the
des
status of
artifices
Ukrainian
pseudo-juridiques
region, be
ou
it
par la force,
through
à travers la détention
pseudo-legal
arbitraire,
sleight of hand
la
or by
torture,
force, through
les
arbitrary
déportations,
detention, torture,
la
deportation,
distribution
the
massive et
massive
forcée de
and forced
passeports russes,
distribution of
le
Russian
filtrage,
passports,
l'imposition
screening,
du droit,
or
des
by
médias, du
imposing
système
Russian
éducatif,
law,
de la langue
media,
et de la monnaie
educational
russe.
system, language,
La
and
France
currency.
continuera
France will
de fournir à
continue to
l'Ukraine
provide
le
Ukraine
soutien
the
dont elle a
support
besoin
it needs
pour faire
to
respecter
ensure
son
respect for
indépendance,
its independence,
sa souveraineté
its sovereignty,
et son intégrité
and its territorial
territoriale
integrity
aussi longtemps
as
qu'il
long
le faudra.
as is
Je vous
necessary.
remercie.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
أود أن أشكر كذلك
I would also like to thank
السيدة روزماري
Madam
ديكارلو
Rosemary DiCarlo,
وكيلة الأمين العام
Undersecretary
للشؤون
General for
السياسية
Political
وبناء
and
السلام على
Peace-building
إحاطتها
affairs for her
القيمة.
important briefing.
أولا وقبل كل شيء
First and foremost,
أود أن أؤكد على التزام الجزائر القوي
Algeria's
والدائم
strong and
بقواعد
permanent
القانون الدولي
commitment to the principles of
وكذا
international law
بالمبادئ
and
والمقاصد
to the
الأساسية
principles and
المنصوص
purposes
عليها
of the
في
United
ميثاق الأمم
Nations
المتحدة
Charter
دون استثناء.
with no exception.
كما تدعو الجزائر
Algeria
هذا المجلس
calls upon this council
وكذا المجتمع الدولي
and the international
ككل
community as
إلى
a whole
الاطلاع بمسؤولياتهم الأساسية
their primary
من خلال
responsibilities
التمسك المستمر
through their continued
بهذه
respect
القواعد
for
والمبادئ
these rules,
والمقاصد
principles and
وإعلائها
purposes, and through
وتفعيلها في
upholding
جميع
them and
الحالات
applying them to all cases
دون تمييز
with no
أو
distinction,
تحيز
with no
أو
bias,
انصياع إلى
and with
ازدواجية
no
المعايير.
double standards.
لقد دعونا مرارا
We
وتكرارا
have repeatedly
من هذا المنبر
called from this forum
الأطراف المعنية
called
بهذا النزاع
the
إلى
parties to
تجنب
this
منطق
conflict
المواجهة
to avoid
والتوتر
confrontation and to avoid
وإعطاء
tension
الأولوية
and to
لنهج
prioritize
خفض التصعيد
de-escalation,
والتريث
patience
والهدوء
and calm.
كما شجعناهم
We have encouraged
على
the parties
الانسياق في
to
حوار
engage
صادق
in a genuine
وشامل
and
وبناء
comprehensive and constructive
بهدف
dialogue
التوصل إلى
to
حل
arrive at
سلمي
a permanent,
ودائم لهذا
peaceful
النزاع.
solution to this conflict.
إضافة إلى هذا
Moreover,
كنا قد
we
حذرنا
had warned
من أن ظاهرة
that
الاستقطاب
the
التي تحيط
polarization
بالعديد
that
من
looms
القضايا
over
الدولية
many international
وبالخصوص الملف
and
الأوكراني
especially the Ukrainian
لا تساعد
file
بأي شكل
in
من
no way
الأشكال
help
في إيجاد الحلول
in the
بل
effort
تزيد
to
الأمر
find
تعقيدا
solutions. Rather, they make matters even
وهو
more
ما يفضي
complicated.
إلى
And
عواقب
this would
يستعصي
lead to
التنبؤ بها
repercussions that are hard to
وتصعب
predict
إدارتها
and even harder to manage.
فوحده الحوار
Dialogue
كفيل
alone
بتمكيننا من إحراز
can
التقدم
help us make progress
نحو حل
towards a
سلمي
peaceful
لهذا النزاع.
resolution to this conflict.
لقد أثبت التصعيد عدم فعاليته
Escalation has proven its
فدعونا
futility.
نعطي للسلام والحوار
So let us give
ولهذا
peace
المجلس
and dialogue a
الفرصة
chance. Let us give this
للقيام
council
بالمهام
a chance
المنوطة
to
به
undertake
في
its
الحفاظ على
primary
السلام
responsibilities in
والأمن
the maintenance of
الدوليين
international peace and security.
ودعونا نضاعف
Let
جهودنا
us double our
الدبلوماسية
diplomatic efforts
لتسريع
to
الوصول
expedite
لحل لهذه
the
الأزمة
resolution of this crisis
وتحقيق السلام
and to
العادل
achieve
والدائم
a just and
مع
lasting
الأخذ
peace,
بعين الاعتبار
keeping in mind
مبادئ
the
ومقاصد
principles
ميثاق
and
الأمم
purposes of the
المتحدة
United Nations Charter
المخاوف
and the
الأمنية
legitimate
المشروعة
security
لجميع
concerns of
الأطراف.
all parties.
شكرا سيد
Thank you,
الرئيس.
Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Undersecretary Di Carlo for her briefing. President, I must first address the latest appalling Russian missile strikes on Odessa today. An apparent double-tap strike designed to inflict maximum human casualties and target first responders. Ukrainians are not only mourning the 16 civilians who've lost their lives in Odessa today. Today, Ukrainian civilians in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Crimea are being forced and intimidated into taking part in a sham election. As the General Assembly has made clear, including in October 2022, when 143 states voted to condemn Russia's attempted illegal annexation, these regions are part of the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. The people in these territories voted overwhelmingly to join an independent Ukraine in 1991. There is no popular support for Russian rule, historically or today. Yet, Russia continues to defy the calls of UN member states and the Ukrainian people, pressing ahead with its attempt to consolidate its illegal control. Alarming reports have emerged of officials accompanied by troops carrying ballot boxes from door to door, all part of Russia's effort to cultivate a climate of fear and coercion. As the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has reported today, there is overwhelming evidence that Russian forces have carried out large-scale atrocities in territories under its control since 2022. This includes arbitrary detention, torture, and sexual violence against civilians. And Russia does not allow the UN or humanitarian agencies meaningful access to support the millions of Ukrainians living in these areas. Yet, ordinary Ukrainians continue to demonstrate true bravery by standing strong and resisting Russian oppression. In the past weeks, there's been a surge of demonstrations of resistance. In response, Russia has sent more of its National Guard into these areas to stifle dissent. President, these elections are a sham because of a simple truth. You cannot hold legitimate elections in someone else's country. These elections are a violation of the UN Charter and a fraud, nothing more. They will not be recognized, just as we will never recognize Russia's attempted annexation of Ukrainian territory. So I call on Russia to respect the call of UN member states and immediately halt these elections on sovereign Ukrainian territory, end its aggression against Ukraine, and adhere to all its international commitments in full. The UK will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes to secure a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing and welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, Guyana was among the UN member states that voted in favor of Resolution ES 11-4 in the General Assembly 2 years ago. In adopting the resolution, member states declared that the attempted annexation of the Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine was invalid and illegal under international law. We demanded then, as we continue to do now, that the Russian Federation cease its military operation in Ukraine and immediately withdraw its forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Our affirmative vote for this resolution 2 years ago was a vote to uphold the fundamental principles of international law and the United Nations Charter. One such principle is that of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. As set out in the UN Charter, this basic principle, just 6 words, is the bedrock of international law and is fundamental to global peace and stability. By ratifying the UN Charter and the instruments that make up the international legal regime, we, the United Nations member states, consent to and accept their claim of authority and to be bound by them. Every UN member state, therefore, has an obligation to abide by the Charter of the United Nations, as well as the wider body of international law, and is subject to them, must apply them in their international relations, and is equal before them. In this vein, Guyana deplores any action that contravenes these basic tenets of international law, including the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. We also reject any unilateral proclamation of sovereignty by one state over the territory of another state, and call for full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Guyana is extremely concerned about the elections organized on Ukraine's territory, without the consent of its elected government and conducted by a foreign government. Such actions are inconsistent with the norms and principles of international law and the UN Charter, and are therefore illegal. Mr. President, this war has only brought unimaginable suffering and trauma for generations of Ukrainian and Russian citizens. We are constantly confronted with reports of indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and of multiple violations being committed against women and children. Parties must fully comply with their obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. The war must end now. Prolonging the war only exacerbates the risks and consequences for all concerned and further threatens international peace and security. Guyana therefore stresses the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means. We urge this Council to work together to pave a path towards peace and to put an end to the suffering in Ukraine. Guyana is prepared to do its part to advance this objective. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Прежде чем я начну свое выступление, хотел бы для протокола зафиксировать наше принципиальное несогласие с подходом, избранным японским председательством в отношении приглашения на сегодняшнее заседание делегации по правилам 37 и 39. Их общее число составляет 6, что очевидно избыточно для такого формата, как брифинг, который, в отличие от открытых дебатов с широким кругом участников, предполагает сфокусированную дискуссию. Мы уже неоднократно говорили о том, что практика, когда трибуна Совета Безопасности превращается для делегаций, не являющихся его членами, вместо для минуты славы перед национальными телекамерами, порочна и подрывает авторитет Совета. Как показывает практика, никакой добавленной стоимости выступления членов ЕС в дискуссию не вносит. Это из раза в раз написанные под копирку тезисы в русле общей позиции ЕС и НАТО. Не видим смысла в участии отдельных членов Евросоюза вдобавок к представителю Брюсселя. Это пустая трата времени и дефицитных ресурсов перевода и конференционных услуг. У нас их сейчас иной раз не хватает на куда более важные обсуждения. Сожалеем, что японское председательство, которое заявляет о своей строгой приверженности правилам процедуры Совета Безопасности, грубо подрывает сложившуюся в нем практику работы.
Undermining the practice of work that has been established. Mr. President,
мы сегодня выслушали и еще, видимо, выслушаем немало антироссийских филиппик в связи с происходящим на Украине. Собственно, ради того, чтобы выпустить пар и продемонстрировать общественности, что тема Украины по-прежнему находится в фокусе внимания Совета Безопасности ООН, наши западные коллеги и созывают эти заседания. При этом алгоритм выдвигаемых в наш адрес обвинений особо не меняется.
levied against us has
За
not
последствия
changed
наших
much.
высокоточных
The
ударов,
portrayal
наносимых
of
по
our
объектам, связанным с
high-precision
военной
strikes
инфраструктурой
against objects
киевского
linked to
режима,
the military infrastructure of
выдаются
Kiev
результаты работы
regime,
не слишком умелой
portrayal
украинской
of that
ПВО.
as a consequences of the work of the
Поскольку
shoddy
она
Ukrainian
размещается в
air
жилых
defense
кварталах
systems,
в
since
нарушении
they're
элементарных
located
норм
in
международного
residential
гуманитарного
districts
права,
in violation of the basic
на
norms
что
of
наши западные
IHL,
коллеги в
which
лучших
our Western
страусиных
colleagues in the
традициях
best naval
упорно
gazing
не обращают
positions
внимания,
obstinately fail to
обломки
notice, the
малой
wreckage
толики
of a
наших
small
ударных средств,
fraction of
а
our
также
systems,
промахнувшиеся мимо
as
цели
well as
украинские
Ukrainian
ракеты падают на
missiles
жилые
which
кварталы.
miss their targets,
В результате
fall on
гибнут и получают
residential
ранения мирные
districts. As a
украинцы.
result, peaceful Ukrainians die
Население об этом
and are
прекрасно
wounded.
знает и предупреждает
People are
как об
perfectly
угрозе
aware of
именно о
this,
работе
and they
ПВО, а не о
warn
российских ударах.
about the threat specifically from the
Хочу
air
привести вам
defense
конкретный
systems, not
пример.
Russian strikes. I have a
Сегодня уже
specific example
упоминались
that I'd like to
разрушения
share
жилых
today.
домов в
Mention was
городе
made of
Кривой
the
Рог
devastation of
12 марта.
residential homes in Kryvyi Rog on
Вот как
12
ее
March.
описывают в
And this
одном
is the
из
description of
наиболее
this in one of the
популярных
most
украинских
popular
телеграм-каналов.
Ukrainian
А именно из
television
них
channels.
сегодня черпают
And
информацию
presently,
большинство украинцев.
these channels are
После
being
того, как
used
киевский
by
диктатор уничтожил все
by
остатки
Ukrainians
независимых СМИ
to have
и
access to
кормит народ
information after the
исключительно
Kiev
новостным
dictator
телемарафоном.
destroyed all other independent media outlets
Цитирую.
and is force-feeding the people
Администрация
with a
президента
purely news
запустила утверждение о том,
telemarathon. And I
что в
quote,
жилые
the
дома
presidential
попали
administration has
российские ракеты
introduced
серии X.
allegations that residential homes were struck
Все
by
здравомыслящие
Russian
понимают, что
series
попадание
X
такой ракеты снесло бы
missiles.
подъезд,
Anybody with
и
common
жертв
sense
было бы больше.
understands that
Скорее
this
всего,
kind of a
ракету подбило
missile
украинское
would
ПВО,
completely
и
destroy
ее
the
части
entrance, and
упали
there
на
would be
жилые кварталы.
far more victims. And it is more likely that
Администрация президента всегда умалчивает, что ракету сбили
the
над
missile
городом,
was downed by
а уже после
Ukrainian
этого она
air
упала
defense
на
system,
головы
and
мирным
its
гражданам.
wreckage fell on the
А у
home. The
второй
presidential
многоэтажки
administration
четко виден след от
fails to
ракеты
mention this,
ПВО.
that
Вам это скажет
the
любой
missile
эксперт.
was downed over a
Характерные
city,
черты на стенах на
and
это
that it fell
указывают.
on the heads of civilians.
Берегите себя,
And
так как для власти
the
вы
second
всего лишь
multi-story
инфоповод
building
для
clearly
пиара.
shows the consequences of the air
Конец
defense
цитаты.
Missile and the marks of this. And this
Вот
is
и для
something which
наших
any
западных
expert will
коллег
tell you this. These
подобные
are
предсказуемые
characteristic
трагедии всего лишь
features,
повод для
and take
антироссийского
care of
пиара,
yourselves.
и предотвращать их они не
For the
собираются.
authorities are viewing you just as newsworthy
Предвижу
for
эмоциональное обвинение в
PR,
наш адрес
and our
после моих
Western
слов
colleagues
в том ключе, что
have
Россия
no
вообще
concern
не имела
about
права
this.
наносить удары по каким-либо объектам в
There
украинских
I
городах.
can foresee emotional statements
Если бы,
and
дескать, не
allegations
они,
against
то
us
этих трагедий
that
бы не было.
saying that Russia had no right to carry out
Нет,
strikes
дамы и
against
господа,
any objects in
если не
Ukrainian
будут
cities.
наноситься
Had it
эти
not been for
удары по
Russia, they would
объектам,
say that the
связанным с
tragedy
военным
would not have
потенциалом
occurred.
киевского режима,
No, ladies and gentlemen, these
будут
if
другие
there had
трагедии в
not,
городах
if those
Востока и
strikes had not been
Юго-Востока
carried out,
Украины,
there would have been
подобные
other
тем,
tragedies that would have
которые вы не
transpired
хотели
in the
замечать в
cities
течение 8
east and
лет
southeast of
после
Ukraine, in
антиконституционного
eastern and
переворота в
southeastern
Киеве в
Ukraine,
2014 году.
similar to those which you preferred not to notice
Как не
for the course of 8
замечаете и
years
не
after the
упоминаете в ваших
anti-constitutional
выступлениях,
coup in
например,
Kiev in
вчерашние удары
2014.
по Белгороду,
Likewise, you neither noticed
для
nor mentioned
совершения
in your
которых опять
statements
использовалась
yesterday's
чешская РСЗО
strikes
«Vampire».
targeting Belgorod, and once again, the
Ее же,
Czech
напомню,
Vampire
укронацисты использовали
MLRS
в ходе удара
system
по
was
этому
used,
же
and the
городу
same
30 декабря,
MLRS was
когда
used by
погибло
Ukrainian
25 человек.
nationalists during a strike that same year on
Жаль,
30
опять нет
December when
сегодня в зале
25
представителей
people
Чехии,
died.
который несет
Unfortunately,
прямую
there
ответственность
is
за
no
гибель мирных граждан российских
representative, the
городов.
representative of Czechia
Он с конца
is
прошлого
not
года
in
зал
this
Совета
hall,
Безопасности трусливо входит за версту.
Czechia, which bears direct responsibility
Надеюсь,
for the
в
deaths
Чехии
of
найдутся те,
civilians
кто
in
сполна
Russian
спросит
cities.
подельников шайки
And
Зеленского за
since
совершенные
the end
ими
of
злодеяния.
last year, this Czech representative has been cravenly and
Никто из
studiously avoiding the
поставщиков
Security Council. We
смертоносного
hope that
оружия
there will be
киевскому
those
диктатору
found in
не
Czechia
должен
who will
уйти от
fully
ответственности.
hold accountable the henchmen of the Zelensky clique for the crimes that
Об
they have
этом мы
perpetrated.
поговорим
None
подробнее
of
в ходе
those
запрошенного
delivering
нами на
deadly weapons
22
to the
марта
Kiev
отдельного заседания по
dictator
поставкам
should
западного
avoid
оружия на Украину.
responsibility. And this is something which we'll discuss
Может,
in
на него
greater
все-таки
detail
найдет смелость
during
явиться наш
the
чешский коллега
separate
и
meeting
объяснить жителям
on Western
Белгорода,
weapons
а
delivered to
заодно
Ukraine,
и
which we
своей
requested for the
общественности,
22nd of
зачем
March.
Чехия поставляет укронацистам смертельное оружие, из которого они целенаправленно, подчеркиваю, целенаправленно обстреливают мирные города. Пусть он объяснит это, например, 9-летнему Жене, который геройски закрыл собой во время обстрела 9-месячную сестру, и вместе с ней оказался в больнице с тяжелыми ранениями. Или родственникам троих погибших вчера в этом городе, которые были убиты за рулем своих автомобилей. Киевский режим специально обстреливает мирные города с тем, чтобы
actually
запугать
shelling
их и отомстить тем,
civilian
кто выбрал
areas in
вхождение в
order
состав
to
России.
intimidate them and to extract revenge for
Эта
those who
бессильная
chose
звериная
to
злоба
reunite with the
ничего,
Russian
конечно, не
Federation.
изменит.
This is impotent, bestial
Есть
rage,
у
which
нее
of
еще
course will
как минимум
change
одна
nothing.
причина.
And there's yet, at the very
Терпящие
minimum, another
поражение и
reason for
теряющие
this.
одну за другой
The
позиции и населенные
defeats
пункты
and
киевский
the
режим
loss of positions and town
стремится
after town
отвлечь от
by the
этой
Kiev
некомфортной
regime.
для себя
And they are
реальности своих
trying
сограждан.
to detract attention of its own
Для
citizens from
этого
this
выдумываются
uncomfortable
виртуальные
reality.
перемоги,
And to that
вроде
end,
попыток
virtual
прорваться в
triumphs are being
Белгородскую область
fabricated, such
украинских
as the attempt
спецназовцев.
to breach Belgorod Oblast by Ukrainian special
Однако победы
forces.
они одерживают только в
However, they
ТикТоке.
only gain
12 по
victories
14
in
марта
TikTok.
потери
From the 12th to
противника
the 14th of March, the
в
losses
жизни
of
составили
the
1500
in the
диверсантов.
lives of the
Из них 500 были убиты.
adversary were 1,500 saboteurs. Of them, 500 were
Уничтожено
killed.
18 танков и 23
17
боевые
tanks were
бронированные машины.
killed, tanks were destroyed, and armored
Украинских
vehicles
телеграм-каналах
were
называют еще одну
destroyed as well.
причину,
Ukrainian
заставляющую
television
режим
channels
в Киеве
point to another
совершать
reason,
подобные
which
самоубийственные,
has
но
resulted in the
громкие рейды,
Kievs carrying out such a
бросая на
suicidal,
убой технику и
clamorous
хорошо
raids,
подготовленный, крайне
sacrificing
дефицитный для
equipment
Киева
and
личный состав.
well-trained personnel who are already in short supply for Kiev.
Дело в том, что
The
украинский
thing is
диктатор,
that the
узурпировавший
Ukrainian
власть,
dictator who
душащий
usurped
любые
power
проявления
and
инакомыслия,
stifled any
в соответствии
manifestation
с
of
Конституцией
dissent,
Украины с
in line
21
with
мая
the
этого года
Constitution of
становится
Ukraine,
полностью
as of
нелегитимным.
21st of May this year, becomes
Владимир
completely
Зеленский,
illegitimate.
который в свое
Vladimir
время пришел к
Zelensky,
власти под лозунгами
who
того, что
assumed
он
power
слуга
with the
народа,
slogan that he is the
единолично, в
servant of the
нарушение
people,
Конституции своей страны,
single-handedly canceled
отменил президентские выборы,
in violation of the
которые должны
Constitution
были
of
состояться
Ukraine,
этой
canceled
весной.
presidential elections, which are supposed to have been held this spring.
У госпожи Ди Карло мы сегодня
Madam Di
услышали
Carlo
крайне
today
странный
told us
призыв
about an odd call,
соблюдать на наших
a
новых
call to
территориях
respect on our new
украинские законы.
territories, to respect Ukrainian law.
А вы не думали для
Did
начала
you not
призвать
think
соблюдать украинские
initially to
законы
call
режим
for
Зеленского?
Ukrainian laws to be complied with by the Zelensky regime?
Хочу задать нашим
And I would
западным
like
коллегам
to
вопрос.
put a
Вы
question to our
собрали
Western
целое
colleagues.
заседание
You
Совета
convened an
Безопасности, чтобы
entire Security
раскритиковать
Council meeting
Россию
to
за
criticize
то, что она
Russia
проводит
for
демократические
Russia's
выборы на
conduct of
территории,
democratic
которые
elections on
административно,
territories which
политически и экономически
administratively,
являются частью
politically, and
нашей страны.
economically are a part of our
Нравится
country,
это кому-то или нет?
like it or not.
А как вы, с точки зрения
And
ваших
what
хваленных
about you in
демократических
terms
стандартов,
of your
можете
vaunted democratic
охарактеризовать
standards?
единоличную
How
отмену
would you
выборов главой
characterize
государства?
the single-handed cancellation of elections by the head
Как
of
бы вы
state?
отнеслись к тому, если
How
бы,
would you
например, Джо
react if,
Байден
for example,
отменил
Joe Biden
президентские выборы в
were
США
to cancel
или
the
Эммануэль
presidential
Макрон
elections in the
во
US, or
Франции?
Emmanuel Macron were to cancel
Или нам
elections
все
in
это еще
France?
предстоит увидеть?
Or is this something which we have yet to see?
Почему-то ни одного
For
комментария
some
по
reason, you
поводу
have
отмены
not a
выборов на
single
Украине от вас
comment
сегодня не прозвучало.
today regarding the
Точно так же,
cancellation
как
of
вы
elections in
старательно
Ukraine.
замалчиваете
Likewise,
существование в
you
этой стране
studiously
огромного
pass over and
количества
silence the
политических
existence in that
заключенных.
country of a huge number
Это,
of
видимо, тоже
political
прекрасно
prisoners.
вписывается в ваши
This
стандарты
perfectly
демократии
dovetails
по-украински.
with your standards of democracy
Опять не
Ukrainian
услышали
style.
сегодня,
Once
в
again
частности, от
today,
нашей
there was
американской
nothing
коллеги,
mentioned from our U.S. colleague
ни
in
слова
particular,
осуждения по
not a
поводу того,
mention
что
of
украинские
condemnation of the fact
спецслужбы
that Ukrainian
замучили в
intelligence
застенках Харьковского
services
СИЗО
tortured in
американского
a
гражданина,
Kharkov detention
журналиста
center
Гонсало
an
Лиру.
American citizen, a journalist, Gonzalo Lira.
Вызывает также сожаление, что
We also
госпожа Ди
regret the
Карло,
fact that Madame Di
тиражируя
Carlo
откровенные фейки про
has
пытки на
been spreading clear
российской
fakes
территории,
about torture on
не
Russian
нашла в себе
territories,
мужества упомянуть
was unable to summon the courage
трагичную
to
гибель
mention the
Гонсало
tragic death of
от пыток
Gonzalo
киевского режима.
due to the torture
Кстати, гибель
perpetrated by the
своего
Kiev regime, the death of a
Или
compatriot.
такие сюжеты ни вас, ни управления
Are
Верховного
these
комиссара
issues
по
which
правам
for
человека
you
не
or
интересуют?
the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, are they of no interest to you?
Но вернемся к украинскому
Let's
диктатору.
return to the Ukrainian dictator
Как
now.
решить задачу удержаться
As
у
for
власти,
achieving
Зеленский еще
the
не
goal of
придумал.
clinging to
Но
power,
уже
Zelensky
показал,
has not
что
come up with a
готов ради
solution
этого
yet.
утопить в
But
крови
he has
всю
shown that
страну
for that sake
и
of that
пожертвовать
objective,
последними
he is willing
украинцами.
to drown the
И
entire
чтобы
country in
сместить
blood
акцент с
and
этой
to
крайне некомфортной
sacrifice
темы,
every last
ему нужны
Ukrainian.
громкие
And in order
провокации,
to shift the
сопоставимые
emphasis
с
from the very
провокацией
uncomfortable
будущего.
issue, he needs
Но с учетом
loud
того, что
provocation
провокационная
similar to a
сущность
staged
киевского режима уже
provocation
для
in
всех в мире
Bucha.
очевидна,
But given that the provocational essence of the Kiev regime is something which is clear to everybody, and the spectacles are no longer persuasive to anyone. He is failing in this, which is why he has introduced virtual victories and computer breaches. And of course the accusations are levied against Russia.
Как бы то ни было, в одном глава киевской хунты может быть абсолютно уверен. Его подельники в западных столицах, которые в других ситуациях охотно рядятся в тогу защитников демократии, в случае с ним не будут замечать не только его нелегитимность,
for him will fail to notice not just his illegitimacy, but also the litany of crimes and dictatorial decrees from him, as was mentioned by Franklin Roosevelt quite memorably regarding the Nicaraguan dictator Somoza, I quote, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." Unquote. Since then, in American politics, when it comes to similar situations, essentially nothing has changed. Madam President, with your permission, I will not comment on the absolutely unforgivable attempts heard in this hall when it comes to intervention in the domestic affairs of our country. Those who delivered the sponsors, these statements have unmasked themselves. It's a good thing that their words will remain enshrined on the record of today's meeting. Like it or not, today, presidential elections have begun for Russia, and they will last for 3 days, and they will be carried out, including in the Russian regions, which we united with our country as a consequence of the expression of free expression of popular will in September 2022. The vote will take place in fully in line with the Constitution of the Russian Federation. I congratulate the residents of DPR, LPR, Zaporozhye, and Kherson Oblast on this. They're determining their future alongside us, and I wish to congratulate the residents of Crimea for voting for presidential elections for the second time, and 10 years ago, nearly to the day, they voted for reunification with Russia. And you've achieved great success in this time. Crimea has flourished, building a brand new, highly modern infrastructure and social facilities, and this, better than any words, motivates our new citizens to choose a dignified future for themselves and their children. We all, the citizens of the great Russia, will make Russia better and wealthier and more prosperous, and I call on all of my fellow citizens in these 3 days to go to the polls, to participate, to make their free choice. Let our foes and those who are envious writhe in their impotent rage. Our cause is righteous, and we will triumph. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Japan. I thank the USG Ricardo for her comprehensive briefing. At the outset, I would like to express our condemnation on the recent missile attacks on Odessa, and express our condolences for the victims who were victimized. We reiterate that attacks on civilians are unlawful and totally unacceptable. Whenever we attend a Council meeting regarding Ukraine, we do so reaffirming our solid commitment to international peace and security in the spirit of the UN Charter, which has been challenged by actions that gravely undermine justice and the rule of law, the very foundation of the international community. Russia's war aggression against Ukraine has brought us together with even stronger resolve. We must acknowledge that this situation threatens not only the affected regions, but also international peace and security under which we all live. We continue to urge Russia to immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Russia's unilateral holding what it calls presidential election in the occupied territories of Ukraine infringes upon sovereignty and territorial integrity of a sovereign state and is based on the clear violation of international law. Such acts following the Russia's illegal annexation are totally unacceptable and shall never be recognized. We will never recognize so-called elections, past and future, held by Russia in the territories of Ukraine, nor their results. Colleagues, imagine this situation as if happened to you. A neighboring country started a war of aggression against your country and occupied part of your country. Within this occupied territory, the citizens of your own country were forced to participate in the presidential election of the aggressor. This would be clearly unthinkable and acceptable to any UN member state. Let me be clear, as affirmed in the relevant GA resolution adopted by an overwhelming majority of the member states. Russia's attempted illegal annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia, those regions, into the territory of the Russian Federation by force clearly breaches international law, including the UN Charter. These actions in the areas that have been forcefully put under Russia's control are nothing but attempts to acquire territory by force and have no validity. They cannot form the basis for any alternation of the status of these regions of Ukraine. Let me recall the statement by the UN Secretary General in September 2022. I quote, "Any decision to proceed with the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine would have no legal value and deserves to be condemned," unquote. This could not be clearer. In conclusion, as I said at the beginning, our commitment to upholding the UN Charter and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine is unwavering. The overwhelming majority shares these principles and is united to realize a justice and lasting peace in Ukraine. History will show that the futile attempts by Russia to establish a sense of normalcy or legitimacy through these activities are doomed to fail. I shall now make a statement. I resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, and distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo. I thank you very much for your very comprehensive and strong briefing that you delivered today. I also was about to recognize Putin's envoy in the permanent state of the Soviet Union, who extracted himself once again from this council. Having listened to his communist use-style balderdash, I am obliged to admit that there is no added value in the presence of this delegation, other than taking perhaps record of their statements for the purposes of the future tribunal for the crimes committed by Moscow, by its political and military leadership, as well as by the senior diplomats. But wait, there is probably another important thing to mention. This is the complete isolation of the Russian delegation today in this meeting. There was not a single delegation, not a single one, that has found a single word of support of the Russian illegitimate attempts to organize elections in the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine. We have requested this meeting to address yet another violation Russia commits today. It again undermines the bedrock of our international order, principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states. The so-called presidential elections that Russia is holding in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine are nothing other than a flagrant violation of international law, particularly the UN Charter. These unlawful activities also violate Ukrainian legislation. In this regard, we emphasize that any election process in the temporarily occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea, the city of Sevastopol, parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson regions of Ukraine, like any other similar propaganda activities in the past, is unlawful and will be legally null and void. We are grateful to those UN member states who have today co-sponsored the joint statement on the matter. We recall in this document the strong stance taken by the UN General Assembly on the inadmissibility of any alteration of the status of the above Ukrainian regions due to Russia's aggressive actions. The Resolution 68/262, Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, of 2014 reconfirmed that Crimea and Sevastopol are Ukraine. The Resolution ES 11/4, Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, defending the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, adopted on the 12th October 2022 by an overwhelming majority of 143 UN member states, declared the same approach in relation to the regions in question. Hence, voting in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine will finally delegitimize the election process, already dubious from the very beginning. What is now called an election in Russia does not comply with generally recognized democratic principles and election standards. It has nothing in common with the free and fair expression of the will of the people. Instead, it is rather Putin's self-reappointment under the sterile conditions of the absence of any competition. Those who might have been his opponents were killed, arrested, or at best forced to leave the country. Those whom the Kremlin let participate do not even hide their technical role as a mise-en-scène for the predetermined winner. The temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine have a special role in this mockery of an election. Full closure from the outside world enables the Kremlin to fabricate any turnout numbers and election results it desires. We observed a similar situation in the fall of 2022 when Russia reported about 80 to 90% voter turnout at the fake referendums. A year later, at the sham local elections, the Kremlin again fabricated much higher turnout numbers for the occupied Ukrainian regions, from 63 to 76, while the average turnout for Russian territory reached only 43%. Mr. President, the sham election process in the temporarily occupied territories is marked with intimidation and coercion of the local population. The Russian occupiers have elaborated a lot of means to reach this end. Among them, threats against life, illegal detention, denial of access to health care and social services, threats of deportation and deprivation of property. We should not forget that these actions take place at gunpoint. The report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, presented today in Geneva, contains shocking evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, which remain a grim reality in the temporarily occupied areas of Ukraine. Torture and willful killings of civilian residents, rape and sexual violence, and crimes against children are on this list. For instance, as follows from the report, and I quote, Russian authorities, mostly in groups, conducted house searches, sometimes on multiple occasions. They threatened and intimidated victims and their family members with weapons, including by shooting near their heads or legs. Perpetrators raped the victims in their homes or forcibly took them to premises which they had occupied. There were also cases when women, I quote, were subjected to sexual violence as punishment for support of the Ukrainian authorities. Just bear this in mind when Putin's envoy tells you about the so-called free people's will in the occupied territories. Forcing millions of Ukrainian citizens who live in temporarily occupied territories or who have been forcibly transferred to Russian Federation territory to participate in the so-called elections is illegal. We condemn the illegal passportization of Ukrainians on those territories with Russian passports. Moreover, to expand their capacities for falsification, the Russian occupiers have even allowed the local residents to vote using their Ukrainian documents issued before the occupation. All mentioned violations of the norms and principles of international law put under question the legitimacy of the overall outcome of the so-called presidential elections in Russia, irrespective of their preordained results. We therefore call on the international community to resolutely condemn Russia's illegitimate intention to imitate presidential elections in the temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories, to refrain from recognizing the results of these elections, and to impose sanctions on those involved in their organization and conduct. We also call on the UN members to hold to account their nationals who, despite warnings from the Ukrainian side, showed up in the temporarily occupied territories as, quote-unquote, international observers of the fake elections. Foreign nationals who decided to be part of an attempt to legitimize the occupation of the Ukrainian regions will face criminal responsibility under Ukrainian legislation. Mr. President, Putin has been in power for 24 years, not through the free expression of the people's will, but through manipulation of the Russian constitution, propaganda, elimination of political competition, and through violence, including the assassination of prominent independent politicians. Over these years, Ukraine has successfully conducted 4 presidential elections. Compliance of these elections with the standards of democratic elections were observed by the most esteemed institutions mandated to monitor elections, in particular OSCE ODIHR and the Council of Europe. It speaks volumes that Russia decided not to invite OSCE observers, despite these contradicting its commitments as an OSCE participating state. Indeed, this travesty of an election does not require an impartial and independent assessment of the process. In this regard, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, in its resolution 2519, called for the recognition of Putin as illegitimate after the end of his current presidential term and to cease all contact with him except for humanitarian contact and in the pursuit of peace. The undemocratic nature of the presidential election, as well as the use of this election to violate Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, should speed up the execution of the warrant of arrest for Putin issued a year ago by the ICC. Immunity should not be extended to an aggressive dictator reappointing himself at undemocratic elections. The deadly missile attacks against Ukrainian cities carried out by the Russian forces this week serve as another proof of the need to intensify our efforts to bring Putin and his accomplices to justice. This morning, Russia again shelled the city of Odessa with ballistic missiles. 20 people were killed and 73 wounded. Moreover, Russia resorted to a despicable tactic of a double strike, hitting the site again while the rescue operation and clearing of debris were underway. As a result, medical and rescue workers were also among the casualties. Several days earlier, on March the 12th, a night attack on a multi-story residential building in the city of Kryvyi Rih, Dnipropetrovsk region, took the lives of 5 residents. Another 43 were wounded, among them 12 children. 3 people were killed and 12 others wounded on the same day in the city of Sumy, following the drone attack on a 5-story residential building. The organization of illegal elections in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine will be added to the materials of a future trial against Putin. We reiterate that the continued preservation of Putin's aggressive and revanchist regime poses an unprecedented challenge to the world. If not stopped, Russia terror and chaos will spread further. The longer the convulsions of Putin's regime last, the longer and more painful will be Russia's return to the democratic path. While Putin tries to expand his personal power, we urge the international community to reaffirm its respect for human life, the rule of law, and democratic values by maximizing its support for our country and the Ukrainian people in the fight against Russian terror. We also urge the UN member states to support the UN Charter's purposes and principles through continued, unwavering non-recognition of Russia's occupation of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Mr. President, thank you. Italy fully aligns itself with the statement that will be delivered by the European Union and would like to add some more considerations in its national capacity. Far from being an exercise of democracy and self-determination, the illegitimate so-called elections organized by Russia in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine are taking place amidst widespread and systematic abuses of human rights and intimidations. Just like in the last years, it remains crystal clear that such elections merely serve as a charade of democratic principle, masking Russia's imposition of its aggressive and domineering ambitions through coercion and military force. Recalling the 2022 General Assembly resolution, we want to underscore once again the condemnation by the overwhelming majority of the international community against such flagrant violation of international law. Russia's annexation attempts in Crimea, Sevastopol and other regions of Ukraine remain illegal and unacceptable. Mr. President, let me be clear. Italy will never recognize the fabricated results of the illegitimate elections organized by Russia in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. We call on all states to do the same as our common obligation under international law. Italy condemns in the strongest possible ways Russia's continuous brutal attacks targeting civilian infrastructures and cities across Ukraine, as well as Russia's complete disregard to the call rising from the entire membership to put an end to its full-scale, unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine. There must be no impunity for those responsible for war crimes and other atrocities. Russia will ultimately have to be accountable for the catastrophic damages caused by its war of aggression. We reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Ukraine, pay tribute to all those who have sacrificed their lives for the independence of their country, and express our deepest condolences to the families of the victims that continue to be killed as a result of the ongoing aggression. Italy remains committed to the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Political, military and economic support for Ukraine is one of the key priorities of our G7 presidency, and we are determined to continue doing so as long as necessary and as intensely as needed. These principles have been at the center of the G7 leaders' meetings convened by Italy on February the 24th to mark the day of the second anniversary of the aggression, with the participation of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. We strongly believe it's more important than ever to engage the whole international community to contribute to the solution of this devastating, senseless war. Italy remains committed to collaborating with all sincere partners to ensure the widest possible international support for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. The ongoing aggression by Russia must cease immediately, and the responsibility for ending it lies solely with Russia itself. This can be achieved by halting its attacks and withdrawing its forces from Ukrainian territory. Russia may try to bank on the exhaustion of the Ukrainian people and their global supporters who advocate for a free, independent and sovereign Ukraine. But we refuse to allow such tactics to prevail. Justice will prevail. Ukraine will endure. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, first of all, I would like to thank the Japanese presidency for convening this extremely timely and important meeting. Mr. President, in alignment with the definition provided by the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, true elections must adhere to democratic principles, ensuring the free and fair participation of citizens in choosing their representatives. There is no doubt, though, that the imposition of Russian presidential elections in Ukrainian territories under illegal military occupation by the Russian Federation, as well as in the territories of the other states under its illegal control, blatantly contradicts these principles clearly outlined by ODIHR. And that is exactly why we fully understand why Russia decided not to invite the ODIHR and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly observers to the presidential elections which started today. The meticulously staged facade of presidential elections, which Poland sees as a plebiscite of support for Putin's policy, is nothing more than the manifestation of another act of aggression, this time of political nature. There are also yet another attempt to legitimize illegal annexation of Ukraine's territories and violation of sovereignty of territorial integrity, not only of Ukraine, but also other countries subject to the Russian colonization expansionism. Mr. President, Poland condemns Russia's organization of the voting in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, parts of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions of Ukraine. These actions demonstrate deliberate attempt to manipulate the political landscape of Ukraine and undermine its sovereignty. We also believe that any vote conducted by the aggressor under the war conditions cannot be considered as binding. The international community has no right to recognize the result of the presidential elections held by Russia on the temporary annexed territories of another sovereign country. Mr. President, holding sham and staged elections is a blatant proof of the policy of fait accompli conducted by Russian occupiers and their proxies. The discussion on the legitimacy of the electoral process cannot ignore the fact that the president who will run in this election is alleged perpetrator of international crimes wanted by the International Criminal Court. Russian readiness to sacrifice human lives on large scale in exchange for gains on the front lines aimed at bolstering Putin's election campaign demonstrates Moscow's disregard for human life. Mr. President, we call the international community to condemn this act of political aggression that Russia calls elections in the territories of Ukraine that it has temporarily occupied. We also call the international community not to recognize the results of the elections within the Ukrainian territories. It must be emphasized publicly that the elections are conducted in the situation of total crackdown on civil society and human rights, including electoral rights, the lack of meaningful and real competition. We should also not forget that attempted annexation of the parts of Ukrainian territories and the organization of the staged referenda that were condemned by the 143 member states in the United Nations General Assembly resolution adopted on 12 October 2022. To conclude, Mr. President, Poland reiterates the importance of upholding the ODIHR definition of elections as processes that safeguard democratic values, transparency and inclusivity, and condemns any attempts to subvert this for political gains. We cannot expect the impartial, independent assessment of the voting, so the presidential vote will be the second time in a row that the OSCE is unable to observe elections in the country following the 2021 parliamentary elections, when no OSCE observers were deployed. This decision goes against the OSCE commitments made by Russia and proves clearly that the situation of human rights and fundamental freedoms in Russia continues to significantly deteriorate. Therefore, we firmly reject a questionable act of political aggression by the Russian Federation, as much as we condemned its ongoing targeting of civilian populations in Ukraine, which only today, as we heard, resulted in the loss of many innocent lives in the city of Odessa. And I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and we do appreciate the opportunity to participate in this meeting. Today's meeting is about core values of the UN Charter that need once again to be defended: the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And Russia continues its indiscriminate attacks against innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, but also continues to undermine its territorial integrity and sovereignty through multiple illegal actions. A year and a half ago, we stood united in the General Assembly and rejected the Russian Federation's attempts to hold illegal so-called referenda in September 22 in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine. It is now time to stand again against any action that disregards international law. To organize elections in Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, Zaporizhia regions, Crimea, and the city of Sevastopol is a blatant and direct violation of the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and Romania will not recognize the results of the upcoming presidential elections organized by Russia in the temporarily occupied and illegally annexed territories of Ukraine. Moreover, we strongly deplore Russia's intention to open polling stations in other territories, such as the Transnistrian region of the Republic of Moldova or the occupied regions of Georgia, without the consent of the constitutional authorities of respective countries. This constitutes as well a direct assault on the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of these countries. Mr. President, a large number of countries will organize elections this year, including my own country. We are all expected to uphold our commitments and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Earlier this morning in Geneva, 59 states joined the cross-regional joint statement championed by Romania in support of the principles of Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that deals, among others, with the issue of genuine elections. Russia misunderstood the spirit of inclusive and effective participation in elections, as it was also reflected in the Agenda 2030 and the SDG 16. Electoral competitions cannot be organized in illegally occupied territories. We condemn once again any action or behavior inconsistent with international law, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or any other relevant documents. And such actions by a permanent member of the Security Council undermine the same international peace and security that it is bound to protect. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Romania for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. My thoughts are with the victims of one more brutal bombing attack by Russia against Ukrainians today in Odessa. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Georgia, and the EFTA country Liechtenstein, member of the European Economic Area, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. President, the European Union strongly condemns the holding of illegitimate so-called elections in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and in parts of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions of Ukraine that Russia has temporarily occupied. It is yet another manifest violation by Russia of international law, including the UN Charter and relevant General Assembly resolutions, and of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The EU reiterates that it does not and will not recognize either the holding of these so-called elections or the results. All the so-called polls, past and future, are null and void. In 2022, the UN General Assembly decided by an overwhelming majority that Russia's attempts to hold illegal so-called referendums in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine had no validity under international law and do not form the basis for any alteration of the status of those regions of Ukraine. In 2014, the General Assembly similarly decided that Russia's referendums in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol had no validity and cannot form the basis for any alteration of the status of these regions. In other words, you cannot hold elections in areas of a country that you have annexed illegally through force. And yet, the Russian representative here today told us that whether we like it or not, Russia will annex those areas and will hold elections and anything else it wants on them. Whether we like the UN Charter or not, whether we like UN resolutions that were adopted by large majorities in the General Assembly or not, Russia will do whatever it wants with impunity. Coming from a permanent member of the Security Council, boy, is that chilling. And all of us have a responsibility to unequivocally reject Russia's illegal annexation attempts. All of us must be clear to Russia that their actions also undermine all efforts to reach a just, lasting and a comprehensive peace in line with the UN Charter and are flagrantly illegal and unacceptable. The human rights situation, Mr. President, in the temporarily occupied territories also remains of great concern. International monitoring mechanisms, including the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission and the UN Commission of Inquiry, which issued its latest report today, have concluded that Russia has committed a wide range of violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law in Ukraine. The EU fully supports the work of the UN to monitor and report on human rights violations and abuses and to support efforts towards accountability. Russia must enable full, safe, unhindered humanitarian access through the front lines and stop willingly withholding aid from people in need in the areas it has temporarily occupied. Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, has the obligation to uphold international human rights and humanitarian law. I reaffirm the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, as well as its inherent right to self-defense. President, let me repeat, Donetsk is Ukraine. Luhansk is Ukraine. Kherson is Ukraine. Zaporizhia is Ukraine. And Crimea is Ukraine. The world will not accept Russia's attempted land grab, and the aggressor will be held to account. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We also align ourselves with a statement of the European Union. And thank you for convening today's Security Council briefing. I would also like to thank Undersecretary General Rosemarie De Carlo for her valuable insight. Let me start by extending my condolences to all those citizens of Odessa who lost their close ones due to another strike by so-called Russian precision weapons that continue to seed chaos and destruction in Ukraine, killing indiscriminately peaceful citizens. Mr. President, starting from today, the so-called presidential elections are taking place in Russia. In the months leading to the so-called elections, Kremlin has increased its propaganda and media censorship and eliminated opposition members physically, via imprisonment or murder, as it was with Alexei Navalny. Ordinary citizens who, according to Kremlin's twisted KGB logic, display even the lightest kind of dissent are being frightened, silenced, or detained. The number of political prisoners in Russia is rapidly growing. On the legitimacy of these elections, quoting Russia's imprisoned prominent opposition figure, Mr. Karamurza, seems appropriate, and I quote, "Putin is not legitimately elected president. Putin's next term is illegal. He's a dictator and a usurper. It's time the free world finally said so. Sometimes the most powerful tool of all is simply telling the truth." End of quote. Externally, in the shadows of ongoing aggression against Ukraine, Russia is conducting its hybrid operations. During the past month, for example, Russia has initiated criminal cases against more than 80 politicians and senior officials from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Czechia. Furthermore, Russian dissidents, journalists, human rights activists, and others who are living abroad and are opposing Kremlin's revanchist narratives and actions are in danger too. Some are labeled foreign agents, intimidated, threatened. This week, a violent attack in line with Kremlin's actions against opposition was acted out in Vilnius against Navalny's close ally, Mr. Volkov. Mr. President, I would like to emphasize once more that any attempted land grab under any pretext runs against the UN Charter and the international law. It cannot be justified or covered up with any fake referenda at the Russian gunpoint. Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson are an integral part of internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. So-called elections in the illegally occupied territories of Ukraine, therefore, cannot be neither justified nor tolerated, as holding the so-called elections in the temporarily occupied and illegally annexed territories of Ukraine is in itself a grave violation of international law, violation of a UN Charter, and Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Let me remind you that last year the General Assembly overwhelmingly condemned Russia's attempted illegal annexation of temporarily occupied Ukrainian regions. Mr. President, for these reasons, the Baltic states will never recognize or support holding of such fake elections, nor can they accept their results. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and all Russia's criminal actions in violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in its internationally recognized borders are not compatible with Russia's permanent membership obligations. Unfortunately, for 2 last years, by its criminal acts and by shielding away from accountability for its crime with a veto right, this country continues to drag down the entire legitimacy and image of this very Council, and thus of the UN. I regret we were not able collectively to prevent this or to stop it. Lastly, we once again call upon Russia to immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.